Throughout the history of Christianity, few texts have carried as much mystery, controversy, and lasting fascination as the Gnostic Gospels. These forbidden writings claim to reveal hidden stories left outside the official Christian narrative, including the possibility of a lost bond between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and the unsettling idea that Judas Iscariot may not have been history's simple villain, but the one disciple who understood Jesus most deeply. Thought to have vanished for centuries, these secret texts were rediscovered in modern times and have since raised profound new questions about the origins of Christianity, the struggle over which beliefs would survive, and the ancient faith of those who believe salvation came not through obedience alone, but through hidden knowledge. In this video, we step inside these lost books and explore why they were rejected, condemned, and ultimately pushed beyond the boundaries of the Bible. Yet the world that produced them is not easy to define. Gnostic Christianity was never a single church or a fixed creed, but a loose constellation of early Christian movements united by one radical conviction: that Jesus had passed on secret teachings to an inner circle, truths not just about heaven, but about the deepest structure of reality itself. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word for knowledge, and for many of these believers, knowledge was everything. To know the hidden truth was to awaken, to escape illusion, and to find the path to salvation. They preserved these beliefs in writings that presented themselves as sacred revelations, whispered teachings, and alternative memories of the earliest Christian age. And to understand how such dangerous and extraordinary ideas emerged, we have to go back nearly 2,000 years to the uncertain and explosive dawn of Christianity itself. And so, at the very moment when the familiar story seems settled, another possibility begins to breathe beneath it. What if the earliest memory of Jesus was never a single voice, but a field of voices? Some preserved in the light, others pushed into shadow, waiting in silence for centuries until the world was ready to hear them again. In the years after the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, his followers did not remain still. They moved outward, across the roads and ports of the Mediterranean, carrying not only grief and devotion, but also living memories, fragments of speech, gestures, meals, healings, rumors, visions, and the strange certainty that something world-altering had happened among them. Small communities began to gather in homes, courtyards, workshops, and borrowed spaces. And from these fragile circles, the first Christian churches slowly took shape. Yet even in those early decades, there was a quiet and unavoidable tension beneath the surface. The people who had seen Jesus with their own eyes, who had heard his voice directly, who had stood near the source, were aging. One by one, that first generation was beginning to disappear, and with them went the immediacy of memory itself. What had once been spoken face to face now risked dissolving into distance. What had once lived in breath and witness now had to be preserved in words. So the first believers began to write. They did so to remember, because memory fades, and because what is not written can be reshaped, contested, or lost. They gathered stories from those who had seen, from those who had heard, from those who had inherited the telling, and out of this long effort emerged some of the earliest written accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Writings that would eventually become known as the four canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These texts spread widely through the early church and gradually became the central portrait of who Jesus was for those who had never known him in the flesh. For many believers, they became the doorway into the sacred memory of Christianity itself. But while these writings were being read, copied, and passed from one community to another, other writings were moving through the shadows as well. Other accounts, other sayings, other revelations, texts that did not simply retell the public life of Jesus, but hinted at hidden meanings, deeper layers, and teachings meant not for the crowd, but for the few who were ready to hear them. These writings did not always present Jesus as a suffering redeemer in the familiar sense. Sometimes they portrayed him less as a public redeemer and more as a guide who opened a hidden layer of reality. And this is where the story becomes more unsettling, because once these texts enter the picture, early Christianity no longer looks like a single river flowing in one direction. It begins to look more like a crossroads, a living struggle over what Jesus meant, what salvation was, what kind of world human beings were truly living in, and who had the authority to decide. Many of the writings that emerge from this hidden stream are what we now call the Gnostic Gospels, though that label can only capture part of what they were. They were not one book, not one doctrine, not one church speaking with one mouth. They belong to a wider spiritual landscape, a set of early Christian movements that shared a radical intuition that beneath the visible teachings given to everyone lay a deeper knowledge reserved for those willing to wake up. The very word Gnostic comes from the Greek word for knowledge, but this was not knowledge in the ordinary sense, not information, not doctrine memorized, not the kind of truth that sits safely on the surface. It was something inward, transformative, almost like remembrance, a knowing that did not merely tell you about reality, but changed the way reality appeared. For many of these believers, salvation was not simply a matter of correct behavior, ritual belonging, or even faith as it was later defined. It was the recovery of a hidden origin. It was the realization that something in the human being did not belong to this broken and heavy world at all. And so the Gnostics wrote their visions, teachings, myths, and revelations into texts that often presented themselves as secret words of Jesus entrusted to an inner circle, sayings passed in private, mysteries spoken after the resurrection, knowledge too dangerous or too luminous to be handed openly to everyone. For a long time, people knew of these texts mostly through the voices of their enemies. Early church writers warned against them, condemned them, named them as false, dangerous, misleading, corrupt. But the contents themselves remained largely lost, almost like buried embers beneath the official story. They were spoken of, but not heard, remembered, but not read, condemned, but not truly known. It was as though a whole chamber of early Christian imagination had been sealed shut, leaving later generations to guess at what had once been written there. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, something extraordinary happened. The silence cracked. In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a local farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliffs in search of sabach, a rich fertilizer gathered from the soil, when he came upon a large sealed jar of red earthenware. It had been placed deliberately at the foot of the cliff, closed with bitumen, untouched by time for what seemed like centuries. Hoping perhaps for gold or something valuable hidden by the dead, he broke it open. What he found instead were 12 leather-bound books and part of a 13th manuscripts, filled with writing in a language he did not recognize. He could not have known that he was standing over one of the most important discoveries in the history of Christianity. According to the story later told, some of the books were brought home, and in a detail almost unbearable to imagine, his mother may have used part of one manuscript as fuel for the fire. Even now, there is something haunting about that image, as though the lost world of these texts came within inches of vanishing forever into smoke. The path that followed is blurred at the edges, moving through rumor, chance, and the shadowy traffic of the black market. But the manuscripts did survive, and over time their significance began to emerge. One codex appeared in Zurich in 1951 as a birthday gift for the famous psychologist Carl Jung, written in Coptic, the late Egyptian language descended from that of the pharaohs and likely translated from older Greek originals. Eventually, the books were brought together again under Egyptian control, and when scholars were finally given access to them in the decades that followed, they discovered not simply unusual Christian writings, but an entire hidden library, a chorus from another version of the early Christian world. And what that buried library revealed would begin to change the questions people asked about the beginning of the faith itself. That hidden library did more than add a few forgotten pages to history. It opened a doorway into a version of Christianity that felt at once ancient and unfamiliar, as if the same sacred names had been placed inside an entirely different universe. The books found near Nag Hammadi are often described as a library, and that image matters because a library is not one voice repeating itself, but many voices gathered around a shared hunger. Each text is different, each one leans in its own direction, yet taken together, they suggest the shape of a community, the atmosphere of a spiritual world, the kind of questions that kept certain believers awake at night. And if we want to understand that world, there is no better place to begin than at the beginning itself, with creation, with the structure of reality, with the oldest question hidden under every religion. What kind of world are we actually living in? One of the most important texts discovered at Nag Hammadi is the Apocryphon of John, a work that presents itself as a secret revelation and retells the origins of the cosmos in a way that would have sounded both thrilling and dangerous to the early church. On the surface, it echoes the familiar language of Genesis. There is creation, there is Adam, there is Eve, there is a garden, there is a serpent, there is the awakening that follows forbidden knowledge. But then the ground shifts beneath your feet. The story asks a question that is almost impossible to hear without feeling some inner resistance. What if the God who made this world was not the highest God at all? What if the being who shaped matter, law, and earthly existence was not pure goodness, but something lesser, distorted, even blind in its own certainty? It is a shocking reversal, and yet you can feel why such a question would arise. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Creator God can appear majestic, but also fearsome, wrathful, and severe, destroying with flood, judging with fire, striking with plagues, demanding obedience with immense force. Later Christians, of course, did not see this as a contradiction, but the Gnostics moved in a more radical direction. They imagined that the tension itself revealed a deeper fracture. Perhaps the highest divine source and the maker of the visible world were not the same being. Perhaps the world itself carried the mark of a lesser power. Perhaps the pain, confusion, violence, and ignorance woven into life were not a mystery to be explained away, but evidence of a cosmic mistake. In the Gnostic imagination, there is above and beyond the universe a supreme and unknowable divine fullness, often called the Great Invisible Spirit, a reality of pure light, beyond form, beyond corruption, beyond the restless instability of time. Before the worlds, before stars, before flesh, before even the thought of separation, there is only this fullness, silent and inexhaustible. From this source emanate divine realities, not created in the rough sense, but flowing outward like light from a flame, qualities and presences that express the depth of the hidden God. Among these is Barbelo, often described as the first emanation, radiant, primal, and intimately joined to the invisible source. From the interplay of this divine fullness emerge further emanations, known as aeons, luminous expressions of the eternal realm, dwelling together in a perfect order the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness. It is a world not of conflict, but of wholeness, where every being reflects the light from which it comes. But then comes Sophia, whose name means wisdom, and with her the story turns. Sophia, moved by desire, curiosity, or a longing to create from herself, acts apart from the harmony of the fullness. Her movement is not evil in the ordinary sense. It is more tragic than wicked, like the first trembling of imbalance in a place that had known only perfection. Yet from that solitary act comes a being that does not carry the full light of the divine realm. What emerges is malformed, arrogant, violent, cut off from the source that gave rise to all true being. This is the one later named Yaldabaoth, a figure imagined in startling forms, lion-faced, serpent-bodied, flashing-eyed, swollen with power, but empty of wisdom. Cast out from the pleroma and dwelling in the lower regions, he does not know the reality above him. In his ignorance, he believes himself to be the highest God. And from that blindness comes the world as we know it. Yaldabaoth begins to shape the material cosmos, fashioning heavens, earth, stars, and structures of power. To assist him, he brings forth rulers, the archons, beings who govern the lower realms and help maintain the architecture of this imperfect creation. In this mythic vision, the visible universe is not pure evil, but it is a realm marked by distortion, control, and forgetfulness. It is beautiful enough to enchant, solid enough to imprison, and convincing enough to make souls forget where they came from. And then comes the human being. In one of the most haunting turns in the Gnostic creation story, Yaldabaoth places within Adam a spark stolen from the higher light. Whether by theft, accident, or the hidden working of the greater divine order, something from above enters the human form. That spark is the deepest truth of the person. It is what makes human beings both vulnerable and dangerous in the eyes of the false ruler. Because if a human being ever truly awakens to what is within, if they remember their origin, if they realize that the deepest core of the self does not belong to this lower order, then the entire system of domination begins to tremble. That is why, in this myth, the garden is not simply a paradise. It is also a place of containment, a beautiful enclosure meant to keep humanity innocent in the weakest sense of the word, unaware, unawakened, dependent. And the tree of knowledge is transformed from a symbol of disobedience into a symbol of release. Eve becomes not the one who ruins humanity, but the one through whom awakening begins. She sees, she eats, she opens. Adam follows. Their eyes are open not merely to moral categories, but to their condition. They begin to know themselves. They begin to perceive the prison through the beauty, and for that, they are cast out, not simply as punishment, but because awakening is always a threat to powers that rely on sleep. This myth is easy to misunderstand if we force it into the categories of literal belief alone. Its power lies in what it does inwardly. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt that life, for all its beauty, contains some deep wrongness that cannot be solved by comfort alone. It speaks to the quiet intuition that something in us is older than the roles we perform, deeper than the identities handed to us, less broken than the world that trained us to forget ourselves. The Gnostics imagined the human condition as one of sacred amnesia. We are not empty beings, begging for worth from the outside. We are sleeping beings, carrying a hidden inheritance. The tragedy is not that we are worthless, but that we do not remember what we are. And so the central drama becomes not obedience versus rebellion, but sleep versus awakening, forgetfulness versus remembrance, illusion versus gnosis. This is why the Gnostic creation story mattered so deeply. It was not simply an alternative cosmology for people who wanted to be different. It was a way of answering the problem of evil without placing that evil in the heart of the highest God. It was also a way of telling a more intimate story about the human being. According to this vision, every person carries a spark of the divine light, trapped for a time in a world that does not fully know what to do with it. The task of life, then, is not merely to conform, but to awaken, to recover knowledge of one's true origin, and through that remembrance to begin the journey back toward the fullness. But if that is true, if something in the human soul really belongs to a higher realm, then a question rises that the Gnostic texts cannot avoid. Who comes to reveal this? Who speaks the knowledge that breaks the spell? Who enters the prison without belonging to it? And this is where the figure of Jesus begins to change. In the next group of texts, he will appear not only as teacher or miracle worker, but as revealer, the one who does not simply comfort the soul, but calls it to remember. To awaken is one thing, but to be awakened by someone is another. And this is where the Gnostic imagination turns toward Jesus with a kind of charged intensity that feels almost intimate, as if the question is no longer only about the structure of the cosmos, but about the voice that reaches you inside the dream and tells you that the walls around you are not the whole of reality. In many of these texts, Jesus is not centered primarily as a sacrifice to appease divine wrath, nor only as a public preacher moving through Galilee, but as the revealer of hidden knowledge, the one who comes from beyond the false order of the world and speaks in ways meant to stir remembrance in those who carry the buried spark within. This is why the Gnostic picture of Jesus can feel at once familiar and strange. He is still Jesus, still surrounded by disciples, still speaking, still opening a way. Yet the emphasis shifts. The deepest miracle is not only what he does outside the human being, but what he awakens within. In that sense, he begins to resemble a guide standing just beyond the fog of ordinary life, not dragging anyone by force, but saying, in effect, the world is not what you think it is, and neither are you. That is why modern readers so often feel a strange jolt when comparing these ideas to stories like The Matrix. In that film, Morpheus tells Neo that the world he takes for reality is a veil laid over his eyes, a prison designed to keep him asleep. Scholars have pointed out that this line could almost be lifted from a Gnostic text. The comparison is not exact, but the emotional structure is strikingly similar. What matters is not simply that the world is misleading, but that awakening requires a messenger, someone who has seen beyond the illusion and can name it for what it is. In the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus becomes that kind of figure. He is not merely the center of devotion, he is the one who reveals the hidden map. And few texts capture that atmosphere more powerfully than the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the canonical Gospels, this writing contains no birth story, no miracles arranged into narrative, no crucifixion scene, no empty tomb in the usual sense. Instead, it offers a collection of 114 sayings attributed to the living Jesus. And from the very first line, the text makes an audacious promise. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. That is not a line meant for casual reading. It does not ask for passive belief. It demands inward work. It suggests that the sayings themselves are like sealed doors, and that what matters is not simply hearing them, but unlocking them. When scholars began comparing the sayings in Thomas with the New Testament, they noticed something remarkable. Nearly two-thirds of them resemble teachings found in the canonical tradition, yet they are not copied word for word. The phrasing often differs, as though both streams draw from older oral memory, from a time before the Jesus tradition had fully hardened into the forms later accepted as standard. This has led some scholars to suggest that the Gospel of Thomas may preserve very early material, perhaps even echoes of sayings that circulated close to the historical Jesus. That possibility alone is enough to make the text feel charged. But Thomas becomes even more haunting in the sayings found nowhere else, sayings that feel cryptic, symbolic, almost dreamlike. Blessed is the lion that a human eats, so that the lion becomes human. And cursed is the human whom a lion eats, and the lion becomes human. This is not the language of straightforward doctrine. It is the language of inversion, paradox, inward puzzle. It does not hand you a conclusion. It unsettles you into participation. The text asks to be meditated on, wrestled with, lived into. That very quality is part of why it stands apart. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus can be mysterious, but in Thomas, the mystery itself becomes the medium of transformation. The sayings hint again and again that what one seeks is already hidden within, that the kingdom is not simply somewhere else, but in a depth most people pass by without seeing. One saying in particular reveals why this text may have been troubling to the emerging Orthodox Church. If they say to you, "Where have you come from?" say to them, "We have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself." Read plainly, it sounds poetic. Read through a Gnostic lens, it becomes something more radical. A reminder that the human being carries an origin in the higher light, that we are not merely creatures of the visible world, but exiles from a deeper source. This is where the tension sharpens. For the communities that would become Orthodox Christianity, Jesus was not only a wise teacher revealing hidden truths, he was the divine Son whose death and resurrection stood at the center of salvation for all. In Thomas, that drama recedes almost entirely. Jesus appears above all as a revealer of reality, a teacher whose words point toward awakening. The cross, so central in later Christianity, barely stands at the center here. And yet Thomas circulated widely enough that fragments were discovered long before the Nag Hammadi find, suggesting it may once have been read in multiple communities and perhaps even stood, for a time, near the edges of what might have become canon. Its exclusion was not because it lacked spiritual force, but because its center of gravity leaned in another direction. If Thomas gives us Jesus as the cryptic revealer, the Gospel of Judas gives us something even more explosive. Jesus as the one whose deepest understanding is received not by the beloved public disciples, but by the most condemned of them all. In the canonical Gospels, Judas Iscariot is the traitor, the dark hinge on which the passion narrative turns, the one who betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. His name becomes nearly synonymous with treachery. But the Gospel of Judas, a Gnostic text dating to the 4th century and discovered not at Nag Hammadi but elsewhere in Egypt, dares to invert the role completely. Here, Judas is not the disciple who least understands Jesus, but the one who understands him most. The text presents itself as a secret conversation between Jesus and Judas during the final week of Jesus' life. It begins with the disciples offering prayers in ordinary fashion, only for Jesus to laugh at them not with cruelty, but with the unsettling implication that their worship remains tied to lower understanding. Only Judas dares speak differently. He recognizes Jesus as coming from the immortal realm of Barbelo, and by naming that hidden heavenly reality, he reveals that he sees what the others cannot. Jesus then takes Judas aside and discloses to him the deeper architecture of the cosmos, the corruption of the lower rulers, the imprisonment of the soul in the material realm, and the way liberation must unfold. In this vision, Judas's betrayal is no longer a simple act of greed or failure. It becomes a dark obedience, a painful role within a larger unveiling. Jesus tells him, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me," a line suggesting that the outer human form must be handed over so that the true spiritual reality may be released. It is easy to see why this text ignited such fascination when it became widely known. The emotional charge is enormous. It takes one of the most hated figures in Christian memory and recasts him as the only disciple capable of bearing a terrible secret. Historically, the text is much later than the canonical Gospels and cannot simply be treated as a window onto what really happened. But that is not why it matters. It matters because it shows how some Gnostic Christians were thinking, how they used familiar biblical figures to challenge the dominant moral map, how they reimagined rejection itself as a sign of hidden election. Judas becomes the misunderstood one, the bearer of a role too dark for others to recognize. There is a strange psychological power in that reversal, especially for communities who themselves felt condemned, marginalized, or slandered by the growing authority of the church. It is almost as if they were saying, what the world calls betrayal may sometimes conceal a mystery it cannot bear to face, and the strangeness does not stop there. Once these alternative portrayals of Jesus begin to circulate, they open the door to other forgotten imaginings as well. What was Jesus like before his public ministry? What happened in the years the canonical Gospels barely describe? The infancy Gospel of Thomas steps into that silence, though, despite the similar name, it is unrelated to the saying's gospel. This text tells stories of the child Jesus, and some of them are startlingly severe. Here he does not appear as the calm moral ideal later devotional tradition might prefer, but as a child with immense power still learning how to wield it. In one story, after another boy bumps into him, Jesus strikes him dead. In another, when neighborhood children accuse him, he curses them with blindness, only later reversing the punishments after Joseph rebukes him. These stories did not become part of canonical memory, and it is not hard to see why. This Jesus is volatile, raw, almost frightening. Yet the text circulated widely for centuries, and one famous episode in which the young Jesus forms birds from clay and gives them life echoes even into Islamic tradition through references in the Quran. The point is not that these stories are historically reliable. The point is that they reveal how hungry people were to fill the silence, to imagine the hidden years, to place wonder in the spaces the official story left unspoken. Even stranger is the Gospel of Peter, a second-century text that retells the Easter scene with images so vivid they almost pass into mythic theater. In its resurrection account, guards stand watch outside the tomb, the heavens open, mysterious figures emerge with the risen Jesus, and following them is the cross itself, immense and animate. A voice from heaven asks, "Did you preach to those who sleep?" And the cross replies, "Yes." It is one of the most surreal moments in early Christian literature. To modern ears, it can sound almost unbelievable in its imaginative daring, and yet that is part of the point. These texts were not content merely to repeat, they sought to enlarge, reinterpret, intensify. Through them, Jesus appears in many forms: wise teacher, cosmic revealer, dangerous child, risen mystery. What unites these depictions is not consistency of genre, but a common intuition that Jesus came to unveil what the visible world conceals. He is the one who names the prison, who reminds the human soul that it does not belong entirely to what surrounds it. And once you begin to see him that way, another figure starts to move out of the shadows, one whose presence in these hidden texts may be even more unsettling, because some of them suggest that among all the disciples, the one closest to the deepest knowledge was not Peter, not John, not Judas, but Mary Magdalene. And if Mary Magdalene begins to stand at the threshold of that hidden world, it is because the Gnostic imagination was not only asking who Jesus was, but also who was truly able to hear him. Of all the figures in the Christian story, few have gathered more fascination, confusion, and projection than Mary Magdalene. In the New Testament, she appears as a devoted follower of Jesus and one of the first witnesses to the resurrection, a presence at the edge of grief and revelation. Yet as Christian tradition developed, her image became blurred. Church fathers and later interpreters often merged her with other unnamed women in the Gospels, including the repentant sinner who anoints Jesus' feet, and over time she acquired a reputation the biblical texts themselves do not clearly give her. That distortion matters, because in a number of Gnostic writings, Mary is not a fallen woman redeemed by proximity to holiness, but a disciple of unusual insight, someone entrusted with teachings others either do not receive or cannot bear. In that sense, the Gnostic Mary is not simply a character from the past. She becomes a symbol of a deeper challenge. What happens when spiritual authority appears where the official story did not expect to find it? Among the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Philip has attracted enormous attention because of one damaged but unforgettable passage. The text itself is not a gospel in the narrative sense. It is a layered work of esoteric reflections, ritual language, symbolic theology, and mystical instruction. Yet within it appears a line that has echoed far beyond scholarship. Mary Magdalene is called the companion of the Savior, the one whom he loved more than the other disciples, and the text suggests that he kissed her more often than the rest. Because the manuscript is fragmentary, part of the sentence is missing, and because the original language allows for multiple shades of meaning, scholars continue to debate what exactly is being implied. Does companion mean associate, spiritual partner, intimate counterpart, even spouse? Is the kiss romantic, ritual, symbolic, initiatory? No responsible reading can force certainty where the text itself leaves space, but perhaps that space is part of what gives the passage its power. It leaves modern readers suspended between possibilities, not because it is trying to bait them cheaply, but because it preserves a relationship whose deepest meaning may have been understood differently in the community that treasured it. Whether or not the text suggests a romantic bond, it clearly grants Mary a privileged status. She is not peripheral. She is close. She is seen. She is entrusted. And in the symbolic world of Gnosticism, closeness to Jesus is never merely emotional. It signals receptivity to hidden knowledge. The Gospel of Mary makes this even clearer. Though known in fragmentary form before the Nag Hammadi discoveries, it resonates strongly with the same atmosphere. In it, Mary recounts teachings given to her by the risen Jesus, including a vision of the soul's ascent and the obstacles it must pass through after death. The language here is rich with interior meaning. The soul must move through powers, answer challenges, remember what it is, and continue upward toward rest. Whether one reads these images as literal cosmology or as symbols of inner liberation, the effect is the same. Salvation is imagined as a journey of awakening, disentanglement, and return. But perhaps the most emotionally revealing part of the text is not the vision itself. It is the reaction of the male disciples. They are troubled, suspicious, even jealous. Why would Jesus have given such things to Mary and not to them? Why would hidden knowledge pass through someone they did not expect to stand at the center? The tension is immediate and deeply human. The issue is not only doctrine, it is recognition. Who is trusted? Who is heard? Who gets to carry the secret? In these moments, the Gnostic writings feel less like distant artifacts and more like mirrors held up to recurring structures of power. They ask questions that do not remain in antiquity. What truths are dismissed because of who speaks them? What possibilities are erased because they unsettle the expected order? It is one reason these texts still feel alive. They do not simply present exotic ideas. They disturb inherited hierarchies. They invite the reader to sense that beneath public religion there may always have been other currents, intimate and difficult, waiting under the surface. And from there, the question deepens. If these communities imagined salvation as awakening, if they believed human beings carried a trapped spark of divine light, then what would daily life have felt like for those who followed this path? The surviving evidence is incomplete, but enough remains to sketch an atmosphere. Many Gnostics, viewing the material world as compromised or corrupt, likely practiced forms of ascetic discipline. Fasting, celibacy, restraint from certain foods, and withdrawal from worldly comforts were not necessarily punishments, but ways of loosening the grip of the lower order. If the world trains the soul to cling, then renunciation becomes a form of remembering. Some communities may have gathered under teachers in small circles, sharing texts, prayers, symbolic teachings, and rituals that were not meant for the unprepared. Egypt, especially its desert regions, seems to have been important in this story, not only because many manuscripts were found there, but because the desert itself carries a spiritual logic. It strips away distraction, it removes the noise, it becomes a place where the soul can hear the difference between hunger and depth. Among the most mysterious practices hinted at in the Gnostic corpus is the bridal chamber, especially in the Gospel of Philip. The text guards its meaning carefully, speaking in language that suggests a sacrament of profound inner union. The bridal chamber remains hidden, it says, the holy in the holy. That phrase alone feels like a door left half open. Some have imagined the rite as a symbolic marriage, others as an inward reconciliation between the earthly self and its heavenly counterpart, a restoration of wholeness lost in the fracture of creation. What matters most is not reducing it to a single reconstruction, but sensing the hunger behind it. These believers did not seem interested merely in belonging to a religion, they wanted reunion. They wanted to cross the distance between the divided self and its original light. That same desire pulses through the hymns, prayers, and liturgical fragments preserved in these writings. Some contain strange strings of vowels, long vocal sequences scholars believe may have been chanted in sustained tones, perhaps as a way of moving beyond ordinary language and attuning the soul to a more subtle reality. However unfamiliar that sounds, the intuition behind it is recognizable across many spiritual traditions. That there are moments when words are too narrow for what the soul seeks, and only sound, breath, rhythm, and vibration can carry a person deeper. In that sense, the Gnostic world was not merely theoretical, it was practiced, it was embodied. It was sung, whispered, guarded, remembered. But if these communities were once alive enough to produce texts, rituals, teachings, and competing interpretations of Jesus, then why did they fade? Why did the church that survives come to be shaped by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, while Thomas, Mary, Judas, and Philip remained outside the final boundary? The answer is not a single event, but a long process, and within that process lies one of the great reversals in Christian history. In the 2nd century, Christianity was not yet the unified structure many imagine in hindsight. It lacked a universally fixed canon, a fully developed doctrine of the Trinity, and a single agreed framework for defining orthodoxy. Various groups coexisted, argued, wrote, interpreted, and competed. Among them were the communities that would later call themselves Orthodox, centered increasingly around the writings that now form the New Testament, and around the conviction that Jesus was the divine Son whose death and resurrection brought salvation to all. Alongside them were Gnostic movements, for whom salvation meant awakening through hidden knowledge, and for whom many biblical figures could be reread through a very different cosmic lens. These worlds did not merely differ, they struggled over the soul of Christianity itself. One of the key figures in this struggle was Irenaeus of Lyons. In his great work against heresies, written in the late 2nd century, he set himself against what he saw as the errors of the Gnostics with relentless precision. He argued that Jesus did not come to scatter secret teachings among a spiritual elite, but to proclaim a public truth for the whole church. He defended the authority of the writings that were oldest, most widely used, and closest, in his view, to the apostolic witness. He did not destroy Gnosticism in a single stroke, but he helped define the terms by which it would increasingly be pushed outside the center. There is also a practical reason the Gnostic path may have struggled to survive. A religion built around secrecy, esoteric layers, and selective transmission can carry enormous depth, but it does not always scale easily into a public institution. The emerging church, by contrast, was more open, more organized, more structured, and increasingly able to coordinate communities across regions. It grew, it consolidated, it clarified. By the early 4th century, many Gnostic circles were already in decline, while the broader church was rising toward a new level of power. Then came Constantine. For generations, Christians had often lived under suspicion or persecution in the Roman Empire. Constantine changed the balance by granting tolerance to Christianity. And under imperial favor, the church gained a stability and influence it had never possessed before. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, bishops gathered to define core belief, and from that moment forward, the line between accepted faith and condemned heresy became sharper. The final formation of the New Testament canon still unfolded gradually, but a decisive milestone came in 367 when Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, sent his Easter letter listing the 27 books he considered authoritative, the same 27 that now make up the New Testament. By the end of the 4th century, the broad shape of the canon had been fixed, and the communities who cherished alternative gospels stood further from the center than ever. What remained of them retreated to the margins, to quieter places, to the edges of empire and memory. Somewhere in that long fading, a group near Nag Hammadi copied their treasured books, placed them in jars, and hid them in the earth. Perhaps they feared destruction. Perhaps they hoped preservation would outlast forgetting. Perhaps they knew that what the age could not receive might still be needed by another age. And this is what gives the story its final and strangely personal power. These writings are not only relics of a defeated movement, they are voices that endured beyond the world that tried to forget them. They remind us that history is never made only of what won. Sometimes the most unsettling voices are the ones forced underground, not because they were simple truth, nor because they were simple error, but because they opened questions too deep to be settled quickly. The Gnostic Gospels do not demand that you abandon one faith for another. They do something quieter and perhaps more enduring. They ask whether the world you inherited is the only world available to your soul. They ask whether some part of you has been sleeping inside structures you mistook for reality. They ask whether awakening always begins where certainty starts to crack. And in that sense, the buried library in the Egyptian desert still feels less like a closed chapter than a threshold, as if beneath the official story, beneath doctrine and memory and argument, there remains a whisper meant for anyone who has ever felt that something essential inside them was waiting to be remembered. And now, after moving through these buried texts, these hidden names, these strange and luminous ways of seeing, what remains is not only a story about forgotten books, but the quiet sense that what you have just passed through carries its own meaning. The Gnostic writings survived in fragments, in silence, in desert earth, and yet even in their broken state, they still preserve the feeling of an early Christianity that was far more diverse, searching, and alive with mystery than many later generations were taught to imagine. In that sense, their survival feels less like an accident and more like a trace that refused to disappear. And perhaps that is why these writings can feel so familiar and so distant at the same time, like looking into a parallel world that was never entirely separate from our own. If something in this journey felt unsettling or strangely intimate, that too belongs here. Not every question arrives to disturb. Some arrive to make room. Some arrive simply to remind us that the path through mystery has always been part of the human story, and that no sincere search is ever meaningless. So if this felt like a threshold, if it felt like a forgotten chamber opening somewhere just beneath the surface, then perhaps that feeling itself is part of what was waiting to be found. And from here, the next stories unfold in that same quiet light. For me, what stays with me most is the way these writings seem to touch something deeply human. The feeling that there may be more to our inherited stories than what we were first taught to see. Maybe that is why this story can feel so strange and so personal at the same time. I'd love to know how it felt to you. Did it leave you curious, unsettled, comforted, or reflective? Tell me in the comments what part of this journey stayed with you most. And if this video meant something to you, you can leave a like, subscribe, and continue with me into the next story. Thank you for watching and for being here.